The history of human and Federation or Starfleet Starship propulsion is a story of constantly pushing beyond impossible frontiers. What began with simple engines that hurl small spacecraft away from Earth gradually evolved into technologies capable of crossing star systems, traversing entire quadrants, and eventually challenging the very concept of distance and location. Over the centuries, starships progressed from relying on thrust and nuclear power to harnessing exotic energy, manipulating space-time itself, and exploiting exotic hidden layers of reality. Some tech became reliable workhorses for interstellar civilization, while others remained experimental. So here in this video we will explore the timeline and evolution of humanity's starship propulsion in Star Trek. Let's get to it. Now, in the early days of humanity in the Star Trek timeline, just like in our current modern time period, chemical rockets were the engines that first carried people and machines into space. During the 20th and 21st centuries, these rockets powered nearly every launch system from Earth, burning fuel together with an oxidizer to create extremely hot, expanding gas that blasted out of a nozzle and pushed the rocket forward. Following Newton's third law of motion, they lifted satellites into orbit, carried astronauts into the moon, and helped humanity begin exploring the solar system. As technology advanced, humans developed far more powerful and efficient systems, including fusion drives, impulse engines, and eventually the warp drive, which made chemical rockets seem slow, weak, and primitive by comparison. By the 22nd century and beyond, chemical thrusters were kept only on small crafts as simple backup systems for emergencies. Then between the ages of the chemical rockets and the warp drives, nuclear propulsion served as one of humanity's most important stepping stones to the stars. During the late 20th and 21st centuries, nuclear reactors were already widely used on ships because they could produce enormous amounts of energy from only small amounts of fuel. As humans expanded into the solar system, early colony ships adopted nuclear power, allowing them to travel farther and operate for years without refueling. The DY-100 class vessel was an early design of Earth's pre-warp vessels that were in operation during the late 20th century. They had simple nuclear-powered engines and they were equipped with artificial gravity, and they were meant for interplanetary travel, although some became sleeper ships for interstellar journeys. But by the early 22nd century, engineers developed the more advanced iodine pulse fusion drives, which were used aboard the DY-500 class starships. So these later fusion engines generated power by fusing atoms together far more efficiently and thus could power subspace travel. Although later matter-antimatter reactors would vastly surpass these fusion-powered engines, these nuclear-powered ones would become the norm for later ships as impulse drives, which are used for sublight travel between short distances and even for battle maneuvering, as well as landing or docking. Now, in the 21st century, ion drives were developed, and these represented a major step forward from traditional chemical rockets. Instead of burning fuel to create powerful bursts of thrust, an ion drive used electricity to charge atoms into ions and then accelerate those ions with electric fields, which means firing them out of the spacecraft at tremendous speeds. The push created by this process was extremely gentle, far weaker than a chemical rocket, but it could continue for days, weeks, or even months without stopping. Spacecraft like the Shango X-1, which explored Europa in the early 21st century, and the Ares 4 used during the crewed Mars mission in 2032, relied on increasingly advanced generations of ion propulsion to travel efficiently across the solar system. As humanity advanced and developed fusion, antimatter, and eventually warp technologies, ion drives came to be viewed as a slow and outdated technology, much like chemical rockets before them. However, later designs, like on the Class F shuttlecraft of the 23rd century, the ion engine tech was upgraded to be powered by an antimatter-matter reaction, and thus it became very powerful and was even capable of matching the speed of a Constitution-class starship at warp. Anyway, coming back to the timeline, as humanity's space technology continued to evolve, a new type of propulsion was experimented on in the year 2024. This was the magnetohydrodynamic vernier pulse thruster, which is yet another step beyond the slow chemical rockets and the ion drives of the early space age. Rather than accelerating individual ions over long periods, these advanced electromagnetic engines use powerful electric and magnetic fields to push electrically conductive plasma or ionized gas directly through the engine. By exploiting the Lorentz force, the thruster could generate thrust without relying on chemical combustion. The vernier part of the system referred to its role as a precision control engine, producing brief, carefully measured pulses that allowed spacecrafts to make delicate course corrections, maintain orientation, and perform intricate maneuvers in space. On vessels like the Nomad probe, these thrusters provide a level of accuracy and reliability far beyond what earlier chemical rockets or reaction control systems could achieve. While they were not intended to serve as the primary means of propulsion for long-distance travel, they demonstrate how humanity was gradually shifting away from burning propellant and towards manipulating energy and plasma directly. And all these previous technologies led to the invention of the warp drive, which marked the greatest leap in propulsion technology in human history. See, after a century or more of relying on chemical rockets, ion drives, and other electromagnetic propulsion systems, the breakthrough came in 2063 when Zefram Cochrane successfully flew the Phoenix, the first human vessel to achieve faster-than-light travel. Unlike earlier engines that push a spacecraft through space, Cochrane's warp drive manipulated space-time itself. At the heart of the system was a matter-antimatter reactor, where tiny amounts of matter and antimatter were brought together under carefully controlled conditions. Since matter and antimatter annihilate each other on contact, the reaction released enormous amounts of energy. This energy was converted into a highly energized plasma, which flowed through conduits and plasma injectors into massive warp coils, or also called the nacelles. The coils generate a warp field that distorts the fabric of space-time around the ship, compressing space ahead and expanding it behind. Instead of the vessel moving faster than light through normal space, the warp field effectively carried the ship inside a bubble of distorted space-time, allowing it to travel between stars in hours or days rather than centuries. What began as Cochrane's rough prototype soon evolved into the warp reactors of cargo ships, and then gradually evolved into more and more sophisticated warp drives that could push the speed limits into thousands of times that of the speed of light. So as the centuries passed, the warp drive evolved from a crude experimental engine into one of the most advanced propulsion systems ever created by the Federation, with the matter-antimatter warp core as its core powerful heart. The first warp vessel of the 21st and early 22nd centuries used relatively simple cylindrical reactors connected directly into their nacelles, generating just enough energy to create a stable warp field and thus to reach nearby stars. As engineers gained a better understanding of matter-antimatter physics, they refined the process of combining deuterium and anti-deuterium inside the engine's control reaction chambers, using the unique properties of dilithium crystals to regulate and convert the enormous energies that were released. By the 23rd century, warp cores became larger, more efficient, and increasingly integrated into the Starship design, eventually transitioning from older horizontal systems to towering vertical cores that dominate the engineering sections. These new reactors could generate vastly greater amounts of electroplasma, thus feeding powerful warp nacelles through dedicated plasma conduits, and by the 24th century, the warp core had become a self-contained energy plant. But with the other alien races also feeling their own types of energy cores and propulsion systems, sometimes far more advanced than the traditional matter-antimatter cores, the Federation had to develop newer engine types to keep up. By the 24th century, Starfleet had begun to realize that even its most advanced matter-antimatter warp drives was becoming slow and outdated compared to others. This led the Federation to investigate the concept of transwarp drives. Early experiments like the Great Experiment, the one on board the USS Excelsior in 2285, was tested, but they soon discovered that the dilithium crystals and the warp field technologies became unstable at the frequencies required for true transwarp flight, and so that seems to be the end. However, decades later they encountered the Borg, who traveled through these vast transwarp conduit networks that are like superhighways in subspace. See, unlike a standard warp drive, transwarp technology generated a specialized subspace conduit ahead of the vessel. Federation scientists eventually learned to adapt this captured Borg technology. The Federation's most ambitious transwarp breakthrough came aboard the Cochrane in the year 2372. After discovering a rare form of dilithium that remained stable at unprecedented warp frequencies, Starfleet researchers soon developed a new transwarp system. The shuttle first accelerated using a traditional warp drive before switching to transwarp mode and crossing the theoretical warp 10 barrier. See, at warp 10, the ship was unbelievably fast, and it was believed to occupy every point in space simultaneously. Unfortunately, the experiment also revealed severe biological consequences, including causing extreme mutation in the pilot, and thus as a result, Starfleet never widely adopted the warp 10 system. So, as the transwarp drive was seen to be too dangerous for life on a ship, engineers began researching on an even more radical concept known as the coaxial warp drive. Rather than creating a warp field around a ship or opening a transwarp conduit through subspace, the coaxial drive manipulated the fundamental geometry of subatomic particles themselves. By drawing in particles and reconfiguring their internal structures within a specialized coaxial core, the engine could literally fold space, bringing distant points together instead of traveling between them. In theory, this allowed a vessel to cross enormous distances almost instantaneously, making even the fastest warp engines seem slow by comparison. When the USS Voyager encountered a prototype in the year 2374, they saw proof that the concept was possible, but they also witnessed its dangerous flaws firsthand. So the Federation moved on to a new type of starship propulsion, which was a more successful endeavor as compared to the transwarp and the coaxial drives. Instead of relying on matter-antimatter powered warp fields, this quantum slipstream drive generated an intense quantum field through the ship's main deflector, which allowed the vessel to pierce a quantum barrier and enter a highly compressed stream of spacetime known as the slipstream. Once inside of it, the ship was carried forward at phenomenal speeds far beyond those of conventional warp travel, traversing hundreds of light years in mere hours. Unlike the coaxial drive's instantaneous folding of space, the slipstream travel functioned more like entering a fast-moving current in a cosmic river, like a shortcut. The crew of the Voyager spent years experimenting with the technology, eventually discovering that the rare benamite crystals and the sophisticated real-time corrections could make it viable. And by the early 25th century, Starfleet had successfully adapted the technology for use aboard the USS Dauntless and the USS Voyager A, and then that became the norm. So centuries later, more specifically by the 29th century, engineers developed a new type of drive, the hyper-impulse drive, a propulsion system that incorporated principles derived from hyper-subspace research. Unlike warp drives or transwarp conduits or quantum slipstreams, which focus on moving starships through increasingly exotic layers of space-time, hyper-subspace technology dealt with transmitting energy and information through dimensions that lay even deeper than ordinary subspace. Although little is known about its exact mechanics, the technology represents another stage in the long evolution of propulsion, from pushing against matter to warping space to navigating subspace corridors and finally to exploiting deeper layers of reality itself. And then moving forward by the 31st century, the Federation faced a crisis that would have seemed unimaginable to early generations: a shortage of dilithium, the vital material that had served as the regulating heart of matter-antimatter warp cores for over 1,000 years. Federation scientists began searching for entirely new methods of propulsion. One of the most ambitious results was the Singularity drive, an experimental system designed to bypass the need for dilithium altogether, and this they did by drawing inspiration from technologies long associated with the Romulans. During the first testings aboard the USS Miyazaki in the year 3069, however, the technology proved dangerously immature. The Singularity triggered cascading mechanical failures throughout the vessel, destroying critical systems and killing the entire crew. And that had seemed to be the end. But by the year 3195, however, advanced computer systems had been developed to manage the drive safely. But then, the technology was never adopted en masse by the Federation due to some unknown reasons. And so this brings us to the Spore drive, the strangest form of propulsion, which was also called the S-drive. This was experimented on by Starfleet in the mid-23rd century aboard the USS Discovery and the sister ship the USS Glenn. The Spore drive was unlike any propulsion ever seen before. Rather than generating a warp field or opening a conduit, it used spores harvested from the fungus-like organism called the proto-Axites stellar to access the mycelial network, which was a vast extra-dimensional web that connected every point in the galaxy. Once linked to this network, the ship could effectively jump from one location to another almost instantaneously, bypassing the normal limitations of distance entirely. However, following the Klingon War, this technology was classified and eventually erased from most Starfleet records, becoming almost like a legend. But when the Discovery reappeared in the 32nd century, the Spore drive once again had become one of the Federation's most valuable assets, especially after the burn, which created a desperate need for alternatives to dilithium-dependent travel. For a time, many leaders believed it might become the foundation for a new era of transportation. But ultimately, Starfleet chose the more practical pathway drive as its long-term solution. But the Spore drive remains something extraordinary. And so finally, this brings us to the pathway drive. See, by the late 32nd century, the Federation had spent more than a century recovering from the burn and was rebuilding an interstellar society that could no longer rely entirely on traditional dilithium-based warp travel. Although warp drives remained common, Starfleet scientists sought a propulsion system that was far faster, more efficient, and less dependent on resources that had once nearly crippled a galactic civilization. The result was a pathway drive, one of the most advanced propulsion technologies ever developed by the Federation. Unlike conventional warp engines, which create a warp bubble around a ship and carry it forward through distorted spacetime, the pathway drive appears to generate a specialized transit route, kind of like the transwarp drive but different. And this lets them travel through subspace, allowing a vessel to travel at speeds vastly exceeding even the fastest warp factors. Early tests aboard the prototype shuttle called the UFP-99 proved promising enough that Starfleet prepared to install the system aboard the USS Voyager J. And by the year 3191, Starfleet leadership viewed the pathway drive as a more practical long-term solution than even the legendary Spore drive, favoring it as the future backbone of Federation transportation. So from chemical rockets to nuclear propulsion to warp drives, transwarp drives, then the Spore drive to the pathway drive, and everything in between, this is the evolution of Star Trek's Starship propulsion, of course from a human perspective. Now with that, we come to the end of the video. Do hit that like button for support and also click that bell button for regular updates on new video uploads. Also subscribe to be a part of Legion Notebook. And until the next time, take care, boys.